Hi, this is Scott from Chino Basin Water Conservation District here in the Waterwise Community Center demonstration garden. And today we are working on expanding our native meadow demonstration. And so I'm here with a very important tip about how to plant California native grasses and grass-like plants, including the sedges. And one of the things that we love about native bunch grasses and the sedges is that compared to some of the ornamental grass species and turf grasses, they have massive, wide, and deep root systems, which helps them be more water-wise. However, because of that trait, even in their nursery pots, even quality grown plants tend to have lots and lots of roots, oftentimes beginning to circle already. And so it's critically important to properly loosen those roots as you're planting to ensure they can reestablish a more natural root system to go far, to go deep, and to help them become water-wise as they get established. So let me show you our tips for doing that. So this is a 4-inch pot of Berkeley sedge, also known as foothill sedge, scientific name Carex tumulicola. And as often happens, even when getting this from a quality nursery, because these plants tend to grow so quickly, you can't always get a perfect small plant without a bunch of roots in the little pot. And so this is the best quality plant that we were able to get from our sources. And so you can see this plant is already in a state of what's called root bound. Now it could be worse if it was a severely root bound plant. This kind of circling of these roots would be all the way up the sides. And so for many species of plants, if this was a shrub, if this was a perennial, I wouldn't want to plant this plant or purchase this plant. But with the grasses and the sedges, this is a sedge, sometimes this is what you have available because they put out these roots so quickly, but they can also tolerate quite a bit of root disturbance. And so what we are going to do is we are going to pull apart and loosen this root system, and the plant is going to bounce back from that just fine. So first, we're going to dig our hole about twice as wide as this 4-inch pot and about as deep as the pot. Okay, here we have our hole at about the right size and shape. And you'll notice that what I've done is I've matched the top of the root ball with the surrounding soil. So if you are digging this into an area and planting it where there's already some wood chip mulch, make sure to pull that mulch back and make sure that you're planting your native grasses or sedges about even with the surrounding soil. If you've looked at our other content online and if you've come to our workshops, you might be saying, wait, Scott, I thought you said that native plants should be planted higher than the surrounding soil. And that is true for most species. For most of the California native shrubs, perennials, trees, we always do recommend planting the root crown where the main stem or the branch hits the soil in the pot about an inch or so higher than the surrounding soil, because they can be a little prone to rotting if however that ever sinks and if they're accumulating too much moisture there. With the native grasses and sedges, that's not really an issue. They don't have a single sensitive spot where they're reaching the soil. So you don't want to plant them down in a hole, but you also don't want to plant them really high. So we kind of plant them like this. And then if you have any amount of clay in your soil, it's really good to take whatever your digging implement is and to kind of randomly break up or fracture the sides of the hole. This is for all plants because the clay particles in the soil, when you're digging along them, can actually kind of align and almost form a little pot. That gives the roots some good access to get out of that planting hole. So next step, I always like to have a bucket of water nearby, and I like to soak the root ball. Take a quick listen. And if you could hear those bubbles, even though this plant got watered today and doesn't feel dry, what I really like to do is make sure this root ball is sort of fully charged up with water before I put it down into its planting. Make sure the plant doesn't suffer any water stress between the time I plant it and when planting in this area is done and things are getting watered in. So a little bit of extra insurance. And so now it's time to open up this root system. And depending on how tight it is, you can just use your fingers, but this is pretty tight. And so there's a couple of other tools that I will often use. My favorite tool for this is a hori hori, sometimes called a Japanese garden knife. Quality nurseries often have these. They're easy to order online. I always recommend whatever brand it is, make sure it's one that is completely stainless steel so it won't rust. Some of them are carbon steel and those will rust. I like the ones that have one straight side and one serrated side, and it's basically halfway between a trowel and a knife. You do need to be a little bit careful. It's possible to cut yourself, but it's not razor sharp or knife sharp. And you can see it really just helps get in there and start to open things up. I'm still going to do a little bit more work with my hands afterwards. Make sure you're never going to be going in a direction where you're going to stab your hand. So you can see I'm working away from my hand as I open this up and start to detangle these roots. And so the ideal is you will rip a few roots as you do this, but the ideal is to be able to open things up, detangle them, while not ripping all of the roots, because these roots will still be working for the plant. But I wanted to make this video to show how rough you sometimes do need to be, because if you don't really loosen this up, these things are just going to stay tangled down in the hole. And so I wouldn't be this rough with most species of plants, but our grasses and our sedges, absolutely, this is going to help them so they can start to set up their natural root pattern again and transition to life in the ground. And so even with this, you can see I'm going to do a little bit more pruning because there's so many roots down here now outside of the soil that when I stick this down in here, it'd be hard to make sure that there's good soil contact with all of the roots. So I'm going to take out my pruners and I'm going to do a little bit of pruning. So here we are. We've loosened things up a lot. We've invested time. And so certainly if you have the ability to get a plant that's a little bit younger, doesn't have this kind of bound up root system, you'll plant faster, things will go more efficiently, but sometimes this is perfectly acceptable and might be what you need to deal with, especially if you're ordering in bulk to do a large planting. And so we want to make sure we have a little bit of loose soil down at the bottom so we can ensure some good soil contact here. Stick our plant in, and now we are going to add about half the soil back into this hole and make sure we pack down, not to really compact it, but slightly compact it to make sure we have some good contact with the soil. And now we are going to finish the rest of the way. And now depending on what irrigation system you have, if you're just putting one plant in the ground and you're going to be hand watering, you might want to build a little watering ring around it. We are on an overhead spray high efficiency irrigation system in this area. So we are going to replant this whole dirt area to a new meadow planting and be able to gently water in everything all at once. Now, before we move on from here, I want to show you in comparison what a kind of more almost perfect root system would look like for a 4-inch. This one's a true grass. This is blue grama grass, Bouteloua gracilis. And so you can see also 4-inch size in comparison looks what some people might consider kind of small, but to me, this is perfect because if we gently open things up, we can see just a couple of roots out at the edge, but look, it's already starting to get matted up down at the bottom. And so in comparison, if we were planting this one, we'd dig our hole, we'd maybe loosen the sides just a little, and we just gently work with our fingers, the bottom. And so there's still some work to do, even in this little one, because we don't want this to continue to grow in tight tangles and get root bounds. With the native grasses and sedges, you're almost always doing some amount of root loosening, but you can just kind of pull off the real bound part, and there you go. And this technique is going to apply to every single size of native grass, sedge, grass-like plant. And so here we have a 1-gallon deer grass, Muhlenbergia rigens, and this is a beautiful, young, very vigorous plant. But if we take a look at the root ball, and this is always going to be the case for deer grass. This is about the smallest you'll find it. Oftentimes they're bigger, but even at this small size, look at all of these roots because this is a plant with a massive root system. That's what makes it so good at being water-wise. And so with this, we can do our loosening, or sometimes especially with the Muhlenbergias, there's already this thick mat. And so if this is any bigger, you would especially have that. And so you're going to want to hand loosen the sides like we talked about. But if there's really a thick mat at the bottom, you can take your hori-hori. You can also use an old serrated knife from, the kitchen or from a thrift store or something like that. And these plants are quite tolerant of just having the entire bottom, if that's going to be the most efficient thing, shaved off with the serrated knife. You can still see there's plenty of roots here, and they're tolerant of that root disturbance. And you really want to make sure, even these small roots that are kind of circling, you want to make sure that all of them, when you put the plant into the ground, are going to be able to grow in an outward direction and not be circling down in the hole. If they're circling down in there, that plant is absolutely going to be stunted. It's never going to grow to its full potential. If you have a large grass or meadow planting project, you also might be planting from a plug flat, which is this, or from what are called rose pots, which are tiny 2-inch pots. So this is a plug flat, and it has a variety of individual plugs. And so you would order these by the entire flat. You plant them when they're much smaller, and it's much more economical to plant, and they grow in pretty quickly. So this is Carex panza, which we're going to be using in parts of this planting. Common names, goes by a couple of names, sometimes called California meadow sedge, sometimes called dune sedge. And so the technique with these is exactly the same. So this is a pretty nice, relatively young flat of these, but you can see it already does have a little bit of that circling. It happens super quickly in these young plugs. And so this also needs to be loosened up some, and better to be erring on the end of loosening more rather than less because they are tough. But if this isn't loosened up, it's not going to grow out correctly. Sometimes the best you can get is even a little bit more root bound than this. So to show you the technique for these, if you are planting a whole flat, you can use a typical trowel. You can use the hori-hori, but what I really like to use for these, because the whole process goes much faster, is to use this tool, which is a Japanese hand hoe. Some specialty nurseries sell these. Get this little worm out of the way. You could also easily order these online, and this just allows you to really rapidly create a small planting pocket in the soil, much quicker than with a trowel. You can dip them in water. I don't always do that with the plugs, but it's not a bad idea. And then you're going to open this up. And if you need to use the hori-hori, you can. Just be very careful with your fingers. But with these, I can do the work with my hands. And if you could detangle, again, rather than totally rip apart the root system or remove the roots, that's great. Here, the random long one, that's okay to snap off. And the difference between doing this and not doing this across your planting is going to make a big difference in how successfully things grow in. And then you can just set it back in, being sure to firm up the soil. And there you go. So that's our technique for planting the native grasses, the sedges, and the grass-like plants. That little bit of extra work to get those roots off to the right start is going to more than pay you back in a garden that grows in and establishes beautifully. For more information about the plants we talked about in this video, as well as our other favorite California native or water-wise grasses and grass-like plants, be sure to check out our Water-Wise Garden Planner website, which will give you all of the ongoing maintenance information about them as well.